Alrighty then, next step in textual criticism. I'm going to give you a few basic principles that at least critical textual critics would use in thinking through the principles of textual criticism. And then we'll go through why are there variants and what are the type of variants that exist. First and foremost, basic textual criticism principles. And again, this is a critical text approach as opposed to textus receptus or majority text as it's sometimes called. But the point is a manuscript should be weighed and not counted. Okay, that's sort of a first general principle. In other words, if I've got a dozen manuscripts that I think are just gold-plated and I have really good reasons to believe that they better represent the originals, it doesn't matter if I have 5,000 copies, of a manuscript that is sketchy. Okay, now we can go at all what that means for gold-plated, sketchy, which is not technical terminology, mind you, but I think you get the gist here. Yeah, the fact is, for example, that those who would do the critical text, the current UBS, the Old Westcott and Hort, we look at these Proto-Alexandrian texts, we're saying, well, these are early copy. These are early 4th century texts, or you've got Chester Beatty papyri, Bodmer papyri, and you've got as early as, late 2nd century, mid 2nd century to 3rd century texts. So they're saying, well, in our opinion, earlier is better because there's less chance of it being duplicated in copies. It's closer to the source, it's in the original language and so forth. So I'm going to weigh these more than a 10th century, manuscript that was done, 5,000, 2,000 miles away or something in a different region that had been copied for 1,000 years. So, but again, whether you agree or disagree on that, one of the principles of the critical text approach to doing textual criticism is just that manuscripts should be weighed and not counted. Next, original language reading is always preferred unless proven otherwise. In other words, I've got a Greek reading instead of a translation into Syriac or Latin or something like that. So we're going to prefer the Greek reading unless we've got a good reason to prove otherwise. So remember, all of these are, we might want to call them rebuttable presumptions working through textual criticism. We assume them for the sake of argument, but if we have a good counter argument to reject it for a particular text, we do it. So think of these as rebuttable presumptions for textual criticism. As we'll get to this when we get to the variants, but also number 3, the more difficult the reading of the text is, the more higher probability that it's the original reading. Why? Because there would be a tendency for people to look at a difficult reading and go, this must be an error, I have to smooth this out. See, if you're a scribe copying it, and for example, we'll get into this in the Gospel of John in the prologue, the introduction, there's a big variant there. Is it only begotten God or only begotten Son? There's other variants, but those are the 2 main ones. But you would think about this, the Orthodox at the time of Arius would, for example, would it be more likely that an Orthodox trying to preserve the deity of Christ would look at only begotten God and say, he can't be a begotten God, that must be wrong. He's begotten Son, in some attempt to preserve the deity of Christ. So that would be changing a difficult reading to one that was more easily accepted and easily for our theology. That's why when we look at variants, the one that's more difficult, theologically difficult, to justify, not impossible because all of this is explainable, but there's probably more of a tendency for scribes to make it an easier read, okay? So that's another principle. That's why, like I said, we're going through all the variants. It's not as if they don't have really good ideas of what was the original based on what we think the gold-plated manuscripts were versus the ones later on that are meh, okay? That's what I mean. That's what all this is about. Next, what I mentioned earlier, the earlier reading is more likely the original. And again, that's just a rebuttable presumption, but it's a working presumption. Next, and you know this, you've been to church, right? Okay, the shorter reading is probably the original. Why? Because pastors, preachers tend to blah, 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 blah. Even professors too, right? Blah, 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 blah. That's why you're probably playing all these videos at least double speed and probably with the closed caption lyrics on there, right? So you can get this done quickly. Too much blah, blah. Okay. In fact, I just blah-blahed about blah-blah. See, you're probably speeding it up even more. So the point is that people will take something shorter and elaborate on it. They'll take a reading and make a sermon out of it. So this is why when textual critics look at this, say, well, probably someone is taking the short one here and adding it. Again, all of this, good counter arguments say, yeah, but that's not the case here. That's just a general tendency. All right. A reading with broader geographical or regional attestation is probably the original reading. If it appears in 4 out of the 5 manuscript families, the argument is it started here with this apostle and the apostolic writing or apostolic approval, and it went out to all these regions. It's more likely if 5 out of the 6 preserve this reading, it's only 1 that went astray. That's probably the original reading. Okay, so that's the idea there. And then finally, as far as basic textual criticism, the reading in a larger number of manuscript families is more likely the original. So again, not only regional attestation, where is this found in various regions and churches, but how many manuscript families is it found in? If it's greater, it's probably that. So these are the basic of sort of critical theory textual criticism. And by the way, too, and again, before next segment, I'm going to go into the actual types of textual variants and probably why they exist. But here's something, too, for when you are doing preaching, teaching, Bible study, all of that, remember, it is your responsibility, if you're a teacher in God's church, to get it right, okay? Now, this is why you learn textual criticism, because if there is a variant, and you think it makes a difference, then the fact is that you and you alone are going to have to answer to God for what you preach and teach. So therefore, if there are variants, you better think about that, and when you preach and teach on something, you argue for what you think the correct original reading is. Don't just say, well, that other guy said this is the reading, so I'm just going to base my theology on that. No, if you repeat error, and again, you're just negligent in doing everything you can to establish the truth. It's just that. You're just willingly and negligently passing on error. So be careful, because you're going to be held accountable for that. That's why even when you're preaching and teaching, guess what? Part of your sermon and lesson prep is to do textual criticism. Make sure you've got the right reading. Now, the next and final segment, I'm going to look at the types of variants. But again, I hope this is helpful for you. Thanks.